Hello, happy Monday, ladies and gentlemen. Well, if you cannot tell already, I have chosen this challenge for this Monday of Holy Week, and that is to do this entire video in a German accent of Deutsch. So if you think that this is a very hard to understand accent, I apologize. You can follow along with me on chapter 18, lesson 3, as I'll talk about some key topics about life in the Middle East today. Where are we going from here? Let me talk just briefly about what this week will look like. We are going to finish up the Middle East today. Then we will be doing some little bit of review, and I will assign to you a quiz through Google Classroom, which you will do next week. Okay? So as we go through this, we will be finishing up the Middle East and moving on to Sub-Saharan Africa afterwards. Okay? Okay, let's get started. What is life like in the Middle East? Well, first of all, let's talk about what the people of the Middle East. For the most part, the population is about the same size as the United States. The United States has about 340 million people, and the Middle East has 300 to 330 million people. So roughly the same amount of people. You have some nations that are very urban. Such as like Israel and Egypt. People live in cities, the majority, 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10 of their citizens. But then you have countries like Yemen and Afghanistan that are much more rural, where the majority of the population lives in small communities. No matter what type of population density they have, whether they live in a city and urban life, or they live in small groups in that rural upbringing, the majority of the people who live in the Middle East are going to live near water. Okay? What about the ethnic groups? Well, the main ethnic group in the Middle East is Arab. The majority of people who live in Southwest Asia are Arabs. And there are several nations where they are the majority. So, for instance, like Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Syria, they are the Arab ethnic group is the majority. But they are not the only ethnic group. You also have, for instance, the nation of Israel, which has Jew as the main ethnic group. I believe it roughly comes down to 3 out of every 4 persons is part of the Jewish ethnic group. You have people in Turkey who are Turks. That's kind of easy to remember, isn't it? As we also have, for instance, over in Iran, where the major ethnic group, they don't call themselves Iranian, they would call themselves Persian. They are the Persian ethnic group. Then you'll have some ethnic groups that don't even have their own country, such as the Bedouins. These are desert-dwelling people who live basically like the same way they've been living for hundreds of years. Not much technology. They also have ethnic groups like the Kurds, who are minority groups in the several different areas that they live in. And so the 5 of the most common languages you would hear in the Middle East would be Arabic, Hebrew, Kurdish, Farsi. That is what they speak in Iran. And also Uzbek, which is common in Uzbekistan, but also there are several Uzbek minority groups living in places like Afghanistan and Tajikistan and Turkmenistan. So when you look at the map, you see Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan. What does that mean? The stan in the language means land of. So, for instance, Kazakhstan means the land of the Kazakhs. So the majority group in there is the Kazakhs. So, for instance, in Pakistan, they are the majority of the Paki. They also speak languages, or they don't speak Pakistani. They speak Urdu, which is the Urdu, which is the main language of Pakistan. What about religion? Well, as we've talked about with the Rise of Islam video, the majority religion in the Middle East is Islam, and it's divided between Sunni and Shia. About 90% of the Muslims who live in the Southwest Asia are Sunni Muslims. But then you have Iran, which is majority Shiite or Shia Muslim. You also have, of course, Israel, which is a majority Jewish nation. Christian is a minority religion in the Southwest Asia. But however, you have nations like Lebanon, where about 40% of Christians reside there. About 40% of Lebanese are Christian. You have Syria, where the population is about 10% Christian. Egypt has a sizable Christian population. And what about their economy? What is it based off? Well, it's two resources. Number one is oil. Oil is the lifeblood of many of the economies of Southwest Asia. And so when we talk about this, we must understand that without the oil, these economies would not be in the same situation that they are now. For instance, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait. These nations would not have the same global impact that they have today without their oil. The oil revenue that they have, the money they get from the oil sales, allows them to have a lot of influence in world events, and also requires them to be listened to, since they control a large portion of the world's oil supply. Another resource that is very critical to life in Southwest Asia is water. And as most people live on a water source, it becomes a source of conflict. This is called hydropolitics, where nations actually will argue and fight over where the water is and who gets the amount of water. Let me give you an example. So the Tigris and Euphrates are two of the most important rivers in Southwest Asia. And they cut through three nations, for the most part. They cut through Turkey, they cut through Syria, and they cut through the majority of Iraq, okay, before it flows into the Persian Gulf. Turkey sometimes wants to build water dams on the Tigris and Euphrates in order to store up water. However, if you build a water dam on the river, that means there's less water flow downstream for the other two nations. This becomes a source of tension between these three nations simply over the desire to build, for instance, a hydroelectric dam to give electricity. You would think that a nation should be able to do that for their own nation, but the actions has consequences for the majority of the people who live there in other nations. Another example would be, for instance, in Saudi Arabia, where they do not have a lot of fresh water. And desalinization, which is the process of taking seawater and taking the salt out so it's drinkable, is very expensive. So what the Saudi Arabians have done, they've started to use what's called fossil water. And that is where they dig deep down into the ground to the water that has been in several different rock layers, and they take that rainwater and that's what they use for their irrigation. So they have great length to try and do this. So what conclusions can we make about life in the Middle East? The Middle East is diverse. The Middle East is very different based on where you live in the Middle East. You will speak a different language. You might worship in a different religious tradition. You also are very reliant on water. that is where we are going to end our video today. Comment below with any questions that you might have, and the next couple of days we will be looking at reviewing over all of the topics that we've talked about in our Middle East section. So I hope you all have a wonderful day. Bye bye.